By the time the evening train pulled out of Juniper Station, it had taken with it the last of the noise. The porter's shout died first. Then the iron groan of the cars slipped into the dark. Then even the cinders settled. What remained was cold, a weak yellow lamp over the platform, and a widow in a black coat sitting on a bench with a square valise at her feet and nowhere to spend the night. Hannah Vale had kept her back straight through worse moments than this. Through the coffin lid closing over Samuel in Cheyenne. Through the sale of their furniture, one chair at a time. Through the long ride west with women who spoke kindly until they learned she had little money left. But there was something about being left on a platform after everyone else had been met or claimed or expected somewhere that made a person feel less like a traveler and more like a parcel nobody had signed for. The station master came out with his watch in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. He was not unkind. He was simply a man with a stove at home and no appetite for complication. "Ma'am," he said, shifting from one boot to the other, "I can keep the waiting room open another 15 minutes, but not all night." Hannah pressed her gloves together. They were old gloves, black kid leather gone gray at the fingertips. "I understand." He looked toward her valise, then toward the street where the 2 hotel lamps burned across the ruts. "Try Griggs' house again?" "I did." He gave a small grimace, which told her he knew exactly how that had gone. Mrs. Griggs had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. She had merely stood behind her desk with a ledger open and said that a room required advance payment, meals not included, and respectable women did not arrive after sundown with no arrangement made. Hannah had laid down the coins she had, and Mrs. Griggs had looked at them as if they were buttons. Now the station master cleared his throat. "There's the church shed, but it's not for sleeping." "I understand," Hannah said again. He hesitated, perhaps wanting to say he was sorry, perhaps unwilling to say anything that might be mistaken for an invitation. Then he tipped his hat and went inside. The platform boards held the day's cold the way stone holds water. It seeped up through the soles of her boots. Beyond the tracks, the town lay under a thin crust of early frost. A dog barked once. Somewhere a door slammed. The lamplight made the iron railing shine as if dipped in ice. Hannah reached down and touched the handle of her valise. Inside was one spare dress, a folded apron, her sewing roll, a packet of letters tied with blue thread, and the little Bible her mother had given her on the day she married Samuel. There had once been a silver-backed brush, 2 china cups wrapped in flannel, and a velvet winter cape. Those were gone. What remained was what could be carried and what could not be admitted aloud. Her hunger, her weariness, and the humiliating arithmetic of how many nights a woman could survive on pride. She had nearly decided to ask the station master if she might sit up on the bench until dawn when boot steps sounded along the platform. They were unhurried steps, heavy but even. A tall man came through the edge of the lamplight, carrying a wooden crate against one hip. He wore a brown hat with the brim weather-bleached, almost pale, and a canvas coat dusted white at the shoulders where frost had begun to settle. His jaw was dark with evening beard. One side of his gait was not quite right. Not a limp a stranger would notice first. A hitch, more like, buried in the rhythm. He set the crate down near the freight room door and glanced toward the bench. Most men looked at a lone woman in one of 2 ways. Either they looked too long, as if loneliness on a platform must mean availability, or they looked quickly away, as if misfortune might spread by sight alone. This man did neither. He saw her thoroughly and without intrusion, the way a rancher might note weather in the west and judge what it asked of him. "Train's gone," he said. "Yes." He looked toward the dark street, then back to her valise. "No one meet you?" "No one." That might have been the end of it. Instead, he stood there another breath, the cold making steam of the horse behind him, and said, "You eaten?" The question startled her more than any boldness would have. Hunger had a way of becoming private. It sat behind the ribs and made a woman smaller. To have it named so plainly felt nearly indecent. "I'm not starving," she said. "That wasn't what I asked." For the first time that evening, something very close to anger warmed her. "I don't need charity." He nodded once, as if that answer had been expected. "Then don't call it that." He hooked a thumb toward the wagon waiting by the hitch rail. "I've got stew on the stove from noon, and bread in the tin if the dog hasn't knocked it off the shelf. You can have one warm meal. No dead in it." She studied him in the weak yellow light. There was no smile softening the offer, no easy charm, no oily kindness. His face had lines at the eyes made by weather rather than laughter. One glove was split across the knuckles, the hand beneath was broad and scarred. Not a polished man. Not a reckless one either. "And afterward?" she asked. "You can decide afterward." The wind moved through the eaves with a sound like someone breathing through clenched teeth. Hannah looked at the waiting room door. The station master was already dousing lamps inside. The church shed would be colder than the platform. The hotel would not change its mind. She had not come west to beg, and had no wish to begin now. But there are moments when refusing help is only vanity dressed as courage. "What is your name?" she asked. "Caleb Mercer." "Hannah Vale." He inclined his head, accepting the exchange with the seriousness of a man who believed names mattered. "You can ride up front or in back with the crate. Road's rough either way." That, more than the meal, settled her. A dangerous man would have tried to soothe. A careless one would have joked. Caleb Mercer only stated the road as it was. "I'll ride up front." He took her valise without touching her hand. The wagon smelled of leather, cold wood, and horse. When he climbed beside her, the bench dipped with his weight. He clicked his tongue, and they rolled out from the station into a street, rutted hard by wagon wheels and edged with frost-white weeds. Juniper Station fell away quickly. The last building lamp vanished behind them. Then there was open dark, the sound of harness chains, and the long, pale ribbon of road under a sky pricked with stars. Hannah kept both hands in her lap. The cold needled through her sleeves. Once the wagon lurched in a washout, and she caught the sideboard. Caleb's hand moved an inch toward her, then stopped when he saw she had steadied herself. After a while, he said, "Mercer Place is 3 miles out. Cottonwoods by the creek. House isn't much to look at." "I'm not particular." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. When the house finally appeared, it did not rise grandly from the land. It sat low and weathered beside a stand of bare-limbed cottonwoods, smoke coming from the chimney in a straight, steady line. A lantern hung by the door. Somewhere in the dark, a horse stamped in the barn. The smell hit her before the warmth did. Wood smoke, beef broth, onions cooked down soft. Inside, the room was plain but clean. A cast-iron stove glowed at the seams. Saddles rested on pegs by the wall. A blue crock sat on the table filled with spoons. There was a dog asleep under a chair, old enough that it only lifted one eyelid before deciding she was no threat worth rising for. Caleb went straight to the stove, lifted the pot lid, and stirred. "Sit." She sat. He cut bread with a ranch knife that had been sharpened so often the blade had narrowed to a point. He filled a bowl, set it in front of her, then another for himself. The stew was thick with potatoes, carrots, and beef that had gone tender after hours over slow heat. Grease shone on the surface. Steam lifted against her face. Hannah held the spoon a moment before using it. Her fingers, stiff from cold, trembled once. She hoped he had not seen. He had. He looked away. They ate in the quiet crackle of the stove. Not the silence of suspicion. Not yet the silence of ease either. Merely the silence of two tired people giving their attention to warmth. Halfway through the bowl, she realized she was close to tears and set the spoon down hard enough to click against the crockery. Caleb tore bread, dipped it in his broth, and said without looking at her, "There's a spare room off the back. You can take the bed for tonight." "I cannot repay." "You can stop talking about repayment." The words might have sounded harsh in another mouth. In his, they landed like a blanket set over shoulders that had gone too long without one. Hannah looked down into the bowl where steam still rose. She had been offered rooms before, with conditions sewn into the corners of them. She had been offered pity that wanted gratitude in return. What sat across from her now was stranger than kindness. It was room. It was restraint. It was one man making a place at his table and not crowding it with claims. Outside, the cold deepened over Juniper Station. Inside, the stove gave off its red, steady heat. On the table between them sat the crust of the bread, the blue crock of spoons, and the first warm meal Hannah Vale had eaten in a place that did not ask her to apologize for being there. Hannah woke to the smell of coffee and the unfamiliar creak of a house settling around dawn. For one confused second, she did not know where she was. The room was narrow, whitewashed, and spare. A quilt of faded squares lay over her. A washstand stood in the corner with a blue pitcher and basin. Through the thin curtain, morning came pale as skimmed milk. Then memory returned in pieces. The station lamp, the wagon bench, the steam from the stew. Caleb Mercer saying there was no debt in one warm meal. She sat up. Her black dress hung from a peg by the door, brushed and folded more carefully than she remembered leaving it. On the chair beneath it lay her gloves, set side by side to dry. That small orderliness moved her more than it should have. By the time she had braided her hair and pinned it up, the kitchen stove had fully taken the chill out of the main room. Caleb stood at the counter with his back to her, pouring hot water through a cloth filter into a dented pot. Morning light sharpened the broad slope of his shoulders. He had shed the canvas coat. In shirt sleeves, he looked leaner, harder. His left leg carried weight differently when he turned, but he never fussed over it or tried to disguise it. "Sleep any?" he asked. "Enough." He set a cup on the table for her. Not the thick white mugs hanging by the stove. A cup with a blue ring painted around the rim, chipped once at the handle and mended with glue so old it had yellowed. He must have noticed her glance because he said, "My mother's. It leaks less than it looks." "Then I'll consider it an honor." A flicker passed through his face. Not amusement exactly. Something close. Breakfast was ham, yesterday's bread sliced and fried in bacon grease, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon upright. Hannah had never cared for strong coffee. This morning it seemed like medicine. Caleb ate quickly, already half in the barn by his mind. When she offered to wash the plates, he hesitated, then nodded once. The water in the basin was cold enough to burn at first. She rolled her sleeves and worked in silence, aware of him moving in and out, collecting gloves, checking a lantern, pushing open the door so a gust of air and the smell of horses entered with him. He did not linger in the kitchen merely because she stood there, and that, too, felt like a form of respect. When she dried the last plate, she found him at the door, hitching on his gun belt. "I'll take you to town," he said. The words landed with more weight than they should have. Not because she had expected anything different. She had not. But a small, stubborn part of her, warmed by stove heat and the blue-ringed cup, had imagined another hour before she must step back into uncertainty. "That's kind. It's the road I'm headed anyway." He did not ask what arrangements she expected to make. Perhaps he knew better than to press. Perhaps he had already decided that if there were no arrangements, he would hear it in her voice soon enough. Juniper Station looked meaner by daylight. Night and lamp glow had hidden its patched storefronts, its muddy crossing, its sagging boardwalks. The Griggs house stood at the corner in fresh paint that seemed intended to declare its superiority over everything around it. Mrs. Griggs herself was behind the desk again when Hannah entered, a lace collar pinned at her throat so tightly it gave her the appearance of permanent offense. "I was hoping," Hannah began carefully, "that in full daylight you might know of some respectable house requiring help. Sewing, bookkeeping, cleaning, whatever honest work is needed." Mrs. Griggs closed the ledger with a flat palm. "The laundry woman took on a niece. Mrs. Bell at the lunch counter hired a cousin from Denver. Church already has a pianist, and there's no bookkeeping in this town needing female hands, except perhaps recording pie sales at socials." Hannah kept her face still. "I would take kitchen work." "With winter starting?" Mrs. Griggs's eyes went to Hannah's black sleeves and widow's collar. "Transient women don't fare well here unless they have kin." "I'm not transient. I'm looking to settle where I can work." Mrs. Griggs gave a tiny shrug. "Then you should have come before the first cold." It was not cruelty. It was worse. It was the plain refusal of a woman who had taught herself to survive by closing every door before need could cross the threshold. At the station lunch counter, Mrs. Bell was kinder and no more useful. She wrung her floury hands and said she truly had once meant to answer Hannah's letter, but her sister's girl had arrived unexpectedly, and with prices as they were, she could not afford sentiment. At the Mercantile, the owner offered to keep Hannah's sewing needle packet on consignment if she wanted to sell it. At the church shed, the minister's wife said she would pray. By noon, the sky had gone a dull iron color. Wind ran low along the street, lifting dust and old straw in nervous circles. Hannah stood beside the wagon where Caleb had said he would meet her and looked up at the clouds building over the western ridge. He came out of the feed store carrying a sack over one shoulder and took in her empty hands in a single glance. "No room?" he asked. "No." "No work?" "Not today." He set the sack into the wagon bed. "Storm coming." She looked up again. The clouds were no longer merely gathering. They had joined. "I can sit at the station until the next train," she said, though they both knew the next train east would not come until morning and that the waiting room stove would be let go by 9. Caleb rested one hand on the wagon rail. "Road to the station hotel will be drifted by dark if it starts in earnest." "I cannot impose twice." "You can be practical twice." Something in the bluntness of it steadied her. Practical. Not pitied, not rescued. Merely set for a moment inside the same category as weather, roads, and empty cupboards. He added, "Stay till the storm passes. Do some mending if it troubles you. I've got shirts losing their cuffs and a blanket needing binding." You can be paid from that if your pride needs feeding as much as your stomach." Despite herself, Hannah let out a breath that was nearly a laugh. "My pride has expensive tastes." "Then it'll fit right in with winter." The first flakes began before they reached the edge of town, not soft and pretty, but sharp as ash. By the time the ranch came into view, the cottonwoods were already catching white in the forks of their branches. The afternoon settled into work without ceremony. Hannah shook out the quilts and opened the back room to air. She swept under the bed and found 3 old buttons, a pencil stub, and enough dust to tell her no one had slept there in some time. In the kitchen, she asked where the flour was and received a gesture toward the lower cupboard. She made biscuits, partly to justify her hands, partly because baking had always been the quickest way to make an unfamiliar place less wary. At dusk, Caleb came in from the barn with snow along his shoulders and stopped when the smell reached him. "Biscuits," he said. "I took a liberty." His gaze went to the tray cooling on the cloth. "Take more." After supper, she spread his shirts beneath the lamp and set to work on a cuff worn to threads. Caleb sat across the table, not reading, not talking, simply repairing a halter strap with an awl and waxed twine. The stove ticked gently as it cooled and heated by turns. Outside, wind drove sleet against the windows. Inside, the lamplight gilded the frayed linen, the leather in his hands, the bend of his head. It might have been enough to call such a scene peace. Hannah knew better. Peace was too large a word for one evening. Still, there was something in the way the hours passed unforced that eased a knot she had carried across 2 states. Before bed, she wrote a letter to an aunt in Kansas City with whom she had not spoken in 3 years. The words came slowly. "Dear Aunt Miriam, I have arrived farther west than expected and find my circumstances altered. If it is still possible for you to receive me for a time, I would be grateful for your answer." She blotted the page and folded it carefully. It looked thin in her hand, thinner still against the weight of the storm pressing at the panes. When she rose to bank the stove, she found Caleb already there, kneeling with one hand on the iron door. Firelight sharpened the rough seam of an old scar along his wrist. "I'll stay until the weather clears," she said quietly. "Then I'll go." He fed another split log into the stove. "Weather does what it pleases." "That is not an answer." "No," he said, still looking into the fire. "It's not." Then he shut the stove door, stood with that slight buried hitch in his leg, and passed her on the way to his room, leaving behind the smell of smoke and wool and something else she did not yet have a name for. Not comfort, not safety exactly. Only this: for the length of a storm, she was not waiting on a station bench for the world to decide what to do with her. By the 3rd morning, Hannah knew the ranch by its sounds. The back step had a sharp complaint in the cold. The pump handle gave a hollow iron knock on the second lift. One horse in the barn, an old sorrel mare with a white-marked nose, pawed before feed and rattled her chain as if insulted by every sunrise. The dog under the table sighed in his sleep like a tired old man. And Caleb Mercer was up before all of them. She first realized it when she woke to darkness and saw a bar of lantern light moving across the yard. Snow still lay in crusted sheets along the fence lines, blue in the moonlight. She wrapped herself in the quilt and stood at the window. Caleb crossed from house to barn with a bucket in one hand and a sack over the other shoulder. He did not waste steps. He moved with the practiced economy of a man who had been doing his own labor too long to dress effort up in flourish. At the barn door he paused, putting weight off his left leg for just a second before pushing inside. It was the smallest pause in the world. Because she was watching for it, she saw how much it cost. At breakfast he said only, "Sleet let up." Hannah set another fried biscuit on his plate. "You favor that leg when you think no one is looking." He cut into the biscuit without glancing up. "Then I'll think harder." "You could use the liniment in my sewing case." "I've got my own remedies." The answer might have closed the matter. Instead, as he stood to go out, he put his coffee cup by the stove and said, "Leave the bottle on the washstand." It was the nearest thing to a concession she had yet heard from him. The storm cleared enough by noon for a boy of 14 to come by with a message from the Lower Creek place. Toby Haynes was all elbows, boots too big for his feet, and hair the color of broom straw. He took his hat off when he saw Hannah, then looked at her black dress and became painfully conscious of his hands. "Ma says thank you for the yeast," he said to Caleb. "And if you got time Saturday, Pa wants help with that gatepost." Caleb nodded. "I'll come." Toby spotted the shirts Hannah had hung by the stove and the pie crust trimmings on the table. His grin flashed quick and vanished quicker. He was old enough to recognize changes and young enough not to hide it well. As he turned to go, he said to Hannah, "You baking for winter?" "I'm baking because the flour was there." He considered this with grave respect. "That's good enough reason." When the boy had gone, Hannah said, "Does everyone in the valley know everyone else's business?" Caleb reached for his coat. "Only the parts that aren't theirs." Later, while she was shaking crumbs from the cloth on the back step, Toby's voice drifted back from the yard where he was tightening the cinch on his pony. "Mister!" "Mercer ain't always quiet," he said, in the confiding tone boys use when they have no idea how far sound travels. "Used to be Luke did most of the talking for both of 'em." Another voice, his own conscience, probably disguised as common sense, muttered something Hannah couldn't make out. Then Toby said more softly, "After Luke died, it got different." The yard went still. Hannah did not move. Caleb, standing just inside the barn with a bale hook in his hand, had surely heard every word. When he stepped out again, his face was unreadable. "Toby," he said. The boy went red to the ears. "Tell your ma I'll bring the post drill Saturday." "Yes, sir." He rode off at such speed the pony nearly lost a shoe in the frozen ruts. That evening, wind worried at the eaves, and the house held its own warmth close. Hannah set stew on the table and saw a small drift of papers near Caleb's chair, half slid from a leather folder onto the floorboards. "Your things," she said, stooping before the dog could nose them into grease. They were not letters. They were invoices, feed bills, 2 notices from the bank in Juniper Station, and 1 folded sheet with the county seal pressed into the corner. The figures caught her eye before she meant them to. Freight. Interest. Winter hay purchased at prices that would have been foolish in a good year and ruinous in a bad one. She handed them over carefully. "I didn't mean to pry." He took the papers. "You saw enough anyway." Hannah sat back down. "Yes." He did not tuck the pages away at once. He stared at the county seal, jaw gone hard. "Needn't concern you." "No," she said, "it needn't. But it does." His eyes lifted then, direct and dark under the lamp. Not angry, guarded. A man measuring whether he had room in him for one more witness. "I kept books for my husband," she said. "At the depot before his lungs worsened. Freight tallies, lamp orders, ticket stubs, telegraph charges. He was good with people and poor with columns. I was the opposite." One corner of Caleb's mouth moved, then settled. Did the columns love you back? They respected me enough not to lie. A low sound escaped him, almost a laugh and almost not. She touched the edge of the nearest notice with one finger. These figures are not right. You know that from a glance? I know that no man buys winter hay at that rate unless he was desperate or cheated. And the bank doesn't usually need to remind twice in the same month unless it expects trouble. He leaned back in the chair. Lamplight caught the stubble at his jaw and the tiredness beneath his eyes. You always look at a pile of papers like it insulted your kin? Only when it deserves correction. Silence lay between them, but it was not empty. It had weight and grain, like wood cut along the right seam. Caleb gathered the notices into a stack, thumbing them square. Hannah thought he would refuse. She had, after all, been in his house less than a week. It was one thing to accept biscuits from a guest, another to let her see how close the bank stood to your door. Instead, he said, Pike runs the freight yard account now, since old man Watkins sold out. He says those rates are what they are. Gideon Pike? Hannah asked, remembering the broad-hatted man in town with the silver watch chain and the way clerks straightened when he entered. That's him. I don't like his arithmetic already. Join the line. He rose stiffly, took his plate to the wash basin, and stood there a moment with both hands braced on the table edge as if listening to some ache she could not hear. When he turned back, he brought the stack of papers with him. He laid them beside the lamp. You can look, he said. No grand invitation, no speech about trust, just 4 words, roughened by reluctance. Hannah drew the papers toward her and untied her hair ribbon from around her wrist so she could hold back the loose sheets. Caleb sat down across from her again, arms folded now, watchful in the way of a man who has spent too many seasons seeing good intentions turn costly. Outside, the cold deepened over Cottonwood Draw. Inside, the lamp burned steady and yellow. Hannah smoothed the first page flat and bent to the figures, while Caleb Mercer, who had offered her one warm meal and no more, left his ledger in her hands and did not ask for it back. The first thing Hannah learned about Caleb's accounts was that he had not failed through idleness. That would have been simpler to mend, simpler to despise. But over 3 evenings at the kitchen table, with lamp oil thinning in the reservoir and the stove ticking softly behind them, she traced instead the shape of a man who had been fighting bad seasons with honest labor and losing ground to numbers arranged by someone sharper than he cared to be. Feed had doubled after a hard winter up north. Freight rates had climbed in ways that made no sense between one month and the next. One shipment of fence staples had been entered twice. Interest had been calculated not merely on the original note, but on charges that should never have attached to it. By the second night, she pushed a page toward him and tapped a line with the butt of her pencil. Here, this charge and this one cannot both be true. Either the wagon was full freight or it was partial. Pike billed you both. Caleb squinted, then rubbed the heel of his hand across his brow. He said the axle trouble delayed unloading. Delay is not cargo. He looked at her a long moment. You enjoy this. I enjoy catching lazy theft dressed as paperwork. That sounds near enough to enjoyment. The lamp lit the table between them, the scattered receipts, the crockery cup gone cold, the shadow of his hand over the wood grain. Hannah became aware, suddenly and sharply, of how close their shoulders had drawn over the pages. Not touching. Close enough that if either shifted carelessly, cloth would brush cloth. She sat back first. The next morning, he said, "Come to town." She looked up from pinning a torn hem. Why? Because Pike won't try his full smile if he has to look you in the face while you ask where the numbers came from. That is a curious compliment. It isn't one. Still, she put on her coat. The wagon ride into Juniper Station had a different feel now than the first desperate journey from the platform. The road was ridged with old snow and thawed mud. Cottonwoods along the creek rattled dry twigs overhead. Caleb drove one-handed most of the way, reins loose but never inattentive. Hannah sat with the ledger wrapped in cloth on her lap, like a sleeping animal that might wake troublesome at any moment. In town, Gideon Pike stood in front of the freight office with one polished boot braced against a post and a cigar clamped at the corner of his mouth. He was the sort of man who seemed to have been born in a well-brushed coat. His gloves were kid leather, real and supple. His hair lay flat and dark under his hat, as though weather declined to touch him. "Mercer," he said, smiling with only the front of his face. "And company." Caleb said, "Need these charges explained?" Pike's gaze shifted to Hannah, took in Widow's black and careful collar, then returned to Caleb with a gleam that made her skin tighten. "I had heard you'd taken in help." Hannah spoke before Caleb could answer. "You had heard correctly. I am helping him understand his bill." That checked him for half a beat. Men like Gideon Pike were accustomed to women arranging themselves around his sentences rather than cutting across them. He held out a hand. "Mrs.
Vale."
"Mrs. Vale." He touched his hat brim. "Any friend of Mr. Mercer's is welcome to look at the books, though figures aren't always kind to those unaccustomed." Hannah untied the cloth and opened the ledger on the office counter. Figures are perfectly kind when handled honestly. The freight clerk, a pale young man with a nervous mouth, stopped pretending to sort twine and looked very hard at a nail in the wall. Hannah pointed to the repeated charge. Pike bent over the page, expression smooth, then adjusted the ledger with one finger. "Clerical carryover," he said. "Happens in busy seasons." "Then this one?" she asked, turning the page. "And this misapplied interest?" Pike removed the cigar and smiled again, thinner now. "You keep books, too?" "I can read them." Caleb stood beside her, saying almost nothing. Yet his silence had changed since the station, and she knew it. It no longer felt like a wall she must guess around. It felt like a held line. A choice not to crowd the moment with his voice unless needed. Pike corrected 2 charges with elaborate graciousness and promised to review the others. When Caleb asked for a written statement, the other man spread his hands. "By tomorrow, unless the weather traps my clerk from reaching county forms." The smile returned. "These things move slow, Mercer. Best not to get worked up over winter paper." They were halfway back to the wagon when Pike called after them. "Mrs. Vale, Juniper Station can be hard on a woman alone. If you need proper lodging, Griggs' house has improved its standards lately." The insult in it was so neat it might have passed for manners. Hannah kept walking. Caleb did not. He turned just enough to make Pike look at him fully and said, "She'll decide for herself where she's welcome." No raised voice, no threats. Yet Pike's smile went still around the edges. The road home was worse after noon thaw. At the low crossing by Miller's Ditch, one wheel sank to the axle in mud. Caleb climbed down with a muttered curse, tested the depth with his boot, and set his shoulder to the spoke. "It'll need lightening," he said. Hannah climbed down too, skirts lifted clear of the muck. "Tell me what to move." He looked at her boots, then at the wheel, perhaps measuring the absurdity of both. "Crate in back first." Together they heaved out the sack of meal, 2 bundles of nails, and the wrapped ledger. Mud sucked at Hannah's hem. Wind flattened her coat against her legs. When Caleb pushed again, the hitch in his bad leg betrayed him and he slipped, catching himself on the wagon bed with one sharp intake of breath. Without thinking, she caught his arm. The muscle under his sleeve went hard. He was a large man, solid as a gatepost. Yet in that second, she felt how close pain lived under the surface of him, how much force it took for him to keep his face unchanged. "Steady," she said. His eyes lifted to hers. Gray, she saw then. Not dark at all, but a weathered iron gray that held light in a peculiar way. "I was," he said, though not convincingly. She did not let go until the horse shifted and the wagon rocked forward free of the rut. By then, both of them were streaked with mud up to the knee, and the absurdity of it pressed so hard at Hannah's chest that she almost smiled. Back at the house, she set water to boil while Caleb changed boots in the mudroom. The kitchen smelled of wet wool and coffee grounds and earth thawed out of the road. She wiped down the ledger cloth and hung it by the stove. He came in with his hair damp at the temples where melted sleet had reached skin. "You should have let me handle Pike," he said, not accusingly. "You were handling him. He likes need, smells it. I have known men like that." He looked at her across the steam rising from the kettle. "Your husband?" The question was plain, and because it was plain, she did not resent it. "No," she said, "not my husband." He waited, but she gave no more, and after a moment he nodded, as if recognizing a closed door and choosing not to rattle it. That night they sat on the porch after supper for a few minutes, because the air, though cold, had gone strangely still. The sky was clear enough for every star to look hammered out of metal. Somewhere down by the creek, thin ice ticked against stones. Hannah wrapped her shawl tighter. "Your town doesn't like uncertainty." "No town does." "Your town likes widows even less." Caleb rested his forearms on his knees. "Town likes stories that make them feel safe. A woman alone means either pity or suspicion. Both keep folks from wondering whether loneliness could happen to them, too." She turned her head toward him. "That is almost philosophical." "It's observation. Don't improve it." She looked out into the dark yard and the black line of the barn. "I may still leave when the weather opens." His answer took a moment. "You may," he said. "But don't do it because Juniper prefers an easy story." The words stayed with her long after she lay down in the back room. Outside, the frost climbed the window edges again. Inside, the house gave its small, ordinary sounds of settling timber and distant wind. There was no promise in what Caleb had said. No plea. Only a refusal to let other people's judgment decide for her what sort of life she was allowed to stand in. By December, Hannah's gloves lived on the peg by the kitchen door as if they had always belonged there. It happened the way most changes do on a ranch, without announcement, in the company of repetition. A shawl folded over the same chair 3 mornings in a row. A hair comb left by the washstand. The blue-ringed cup kept near the stove because Caleb, after 2 days of reaching for it automatically when he poured her coffee, no longer bothered returning it to the cupboard. The weather turned mean in earnest. Wind came down off the ridge with knife edges on it. Frost feathered the inside corners of the windows before dawn. The creek thinned to black moving water under a crust of white. Tasks grew heavier and the distances between them shorter, because no one went farther than need required. Hannah mended through the worst hours of afternoon while the light held. Caleb seemed to own more shirts in need of rescue than any man with his habits had a right to. She patched elbows, replaced buttons, turned frayed collars. After Toby carried word to his mother that Mrs. Vale on the Mercer place could put a sleeve right as new, other items began to appear in discreet bundles. Children's stockings, a split apron waistband, a church glove missing 2 fingers and its dignity. Payment came in eggs, apples kept too long in cellar straw. Once in a jar of chokecherry preserves that Caleb eyed suspiciously until Hannah spooned it onto hot biscuits and ended the matter. She learned his preferences without asking. He took coffee black at first light, but wanted a spoonful of molasses stirred into the second cup after dinner. He hated turnips, but would eat them if cut small enough to disappear among potatoes. He left his gloves too near the stove and scorched the leather unless she moved them. He read the livestock reports in the newspaper before any other page and never touched the feuilleton stories at the back. When he came in from the barn in a temper, he went first to the pump, not the table. When worry rode him hard, he would sit with his plate untouched and turn his knife once, twice along the rim. And he learned her in his own rough way. Without comment, he set an extra nail near the back door at a lower height where her shawl could hang without dragging. When he passed through town, he brought home a packet of darning needles finer than the ones she had, wrapped in brown paper from the mercantile. They were there, he said, as if needles simply attached themselves to his purchases by accident. After he saw her rub one wrist at the end of a long sewing day, he tightened the rocker's loose arm so it no longer jerked her elbow every time she used it. One evening he came in with a small sack of apples from the Haynes root cellar and placed them on the counter with the grave formality of a man laying down ammunition. "Thought you might bake them," he said. "I thought you distrusted anything that could be called dessert." "I distrust cakes with too much icing. Apples are respectable." It was not laughter that threaded itself through those days, not often. Something quieter, a softening at the corners, a habit of looking up when the other entered a room, the noticing of absence. Once, near dusk, Hannah found Caleb at the table with Toby beside him and a school primer open between them. Toby had the pained expression of a boy asked to saddle grammar. "You promised your ma," Caleb said. "I promised I'd try." "You're trying loud. That isn't the same as useful." Hannah set down the basket of mending. "What battle is this?" "Toby reads like he's being chased." The boy looked at her hopefully. "Mrs. Vale reads pretty." "I read correctly," she said. "Pretty is extra." She took the chair across from him and showed him how to break the words apart, not with scolding but with rhythm, sound by sound, line by line. Caleb pretended to sort harness buckles while listening. When Toby finally stumbled through a whole paragraph without swallowing the middle of every third word, his face shone. After he left, Caleb said, "You missed your trade." "School teaching?" "Making people think they're smarter than they were when they sat down." "That may be the nearest thing to teaching there is." He turned a buckle in his hands, considering. "You make this house less raw." The sentence was so plain that at first she nearly missed its tenderness. That night, after he had gone to the barn for one last check, Hannah stood alone by the stove with Samuel's ring in her palm. She did not wear it often now. Widowhood in the East had been one sort of uniform, widowhood out here another. The ring had once stood for a vow made in a church full of lilacs and summer heat. Then for worry. Then for duty. Then for grief. It had not yet decided what it would mean next. Outside, snow hissed over the yard in fine, dry lines. Caleb came back in carrying a split armful of kindling and set it down without a sound. He looked from the ring to her face and did not ask what day it was or why her eyes looked older. Instead, he said, "Woodbox was low." After she had gone to bed, she heard him once more on the porch. In the morning there was twice the wood stacked by the door as there had been the evening before, cut fine enough to catch easy, dry enough to burn bright. No speech accompanied it, no sympathy, only care translated into labor. Christmas came as a pale sun over snow, and no ceremony but a better dinner than usual. Hannah roasted the last chicken, made gravy, and baked the apples with cinnamon saved from a paper packet at the bottom of her valise. Caleb shaved, which she pretended not to notice. Toby's family stopped by after church with a loaf and a sprig of cedar. Mrs. Haynes kissed Hannah's cheek as if they had known one another for years rather than weeks, and said, "House looks right with another woman's hands in it." The words could have stung. They did not. Perhaps because they were spoken not as judgment, but as recognition. That afternoon, the snowlight turned the whole world white gold. Caleb went to mend a section of fence where a pine had come down. Hannah watched from the window for a moment, the dark line of him against the brightness, the measured swing of the hammer, the old, careful set of his leg. Something in her chest answered that sight with a pull she did not welcome and could not deny. It was not yet love. She was too truthful for that sort of haste. But the life they were making, day by day, had begun to fit around her in ways that frightened her more than hunger ever had. Hunger was simple. It asked and asked until you fed it or failed. Belonging was dangerous. Belonging made a person imagine tomorrow. In January, the cold settled so deep that even sound seemed to freeze at the edges. The yard carried every footstep as a sharp report. Breath smoked white and stubborn. Metal burned skin if touched carelessly. Caleb wrapped the pump handle in sacking. Hannah lined the inside crack of the pantry door with folded newspaper. They moved through the days with the practical concentration winter demands, saving effort where they could, spending it only where they must. Trust, Hannah discovered, often grows best in weather too harsh for performance. One morning, Caleb came in with blood running off 2 fingers where a fencing staple had kicked back and sliced him to the bone. He held his hand over the sink while she fetched hot water and clean cloth. The cut was ugly, the kind that gaped when he flexed. "It needs stitching," she said. "It needs wrapping." "It needs both." He was pale under the windburn and in no humor to be argued with, which meant he expected to lose the argument. Hannah set the needle in whiskey flame, threaded it, and pointed to the chair. "Sit." He sat. The kitchen was very quiet while she sewed the skin. Caleb did not flinch, though the muscles along his jaw stood out hard enough to cast shadows. Hannah could smell cold leather, clean blood, and the faint smoke trapped in his coat from the barn stove. "You've done this before," he said after the second stitch. Samuel was often injured in ways that might have been prevented by caution. "Was he a fool?" "Only in the energetic sense." A breath escaped him through the nose. "That sounds expensive." It was. When she tied off the last knot, his hand relaxed a fraction under hers. His skin was rough, heat held deep in the palm even after hours outside. She became suddenly aware that she was still touching him long after necessity had ended. She let go first. That afternoon, he left a bundle on the table before going back out. Hannah opened it to find a pair of gloves lined in rabbit fur. Nothing fancy. Sturdy. Warm. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "These are too much," she said when he came in at dusk. They were Haynes's sisters. Too small for my hands. too good to leave hanging at the mercantile.
You bought them for me.
I paid for gloves. You happen to need gloves. No mystery in it. The mystery, she thought, was that a man could be so intent on denying softness while practicing it at every turn. 2 days later, Toby came pounding on the door near dark, face white with cold and fear. His baby sister could not breathe right, he blurted. His ma sent him for help because the road to town was drifted and the doctor might not make it. Hannah had been around illness too long to mistake that panic. She pulled on her coat before the boy finished speaking. Caleb already had the mare saddled and the sleigh traces half buckled. "You'll stay warm in the blankets," he told her.
I will stay useful, she answered.
The Haynes cabin was smaller than the Mercer house and packed with worry. Mrs. Haynes stood by the stove with the baby against her shoulder, the child's tiny breaths coming in wet catches that made every adult in the room count the spaces between them. Hannah took the little girl without asking permission and sat near the heat, loosening bindings, rubbing the small back with a measured hand. Caleb and Mr. Haynes boiled water, hauled in more wood, and broke the drift from the door. No one spoke above what was necessary. The room smelled of fever, pine smoke, and fear held down for the sake of the children watching. The baby eased a little near midnight. By then, the worst of the doctor's route had been cut, and a lantern was moving at last on the road. When they rode home under a sky hard with stars, Hannah's exhaustion was so complete it felt separate from her body. The sleigh runners hissed over packed snow. Caleb drove, shoulders broad under his coat, saying nothing. After a mile, he reached behind the seat, found the extra blanket, and without looking back, tucked it more securely around her knees.
Thank you, she said.
For what?
For the gloves. For not talking when there is nothing useful to say. For knowing when there is.
He considered that. You were good in there.
I was practiced.
There was a pause. Samuel sick long? He asked. The horse's breath rose white before them. Hannah looked out over the dark fields and the fence lines buried in snow.
3 years off and on. His lungs were weak before we married. He was charming enough to make people forgive the rest.
The rest?
He never understood money, or limits, or that a promise does not become easier to keep because it was spoken with a lovely voice.
She wrapped the blanket tighter.
I loved him. I was tired too. Both can be true.
Caleb's hands shifted on the reins. Yes. The single syllable held more than agreement. It held recognition from some room in himself he did not often unlock. A week later, while searching the hall chest for twine, Hannah found an old survey tube and a stack of papers tied with faded cord. She might have left them there. She almost did. But the county seal on one page caught her eye. When she brought them to the kitchen table, Caleb stopped trimming a harness strap and went still. Where were those?
In the hall chest under oilcloth.
She touched the tube.
There are boundary notes, older than Pike's account.
His face changed in a way she had not seen before. Not anger, something more raw, a memory turning in the flesh. That was Luke's, he said. She waited. My brother liked maps better than cattle. Said lines on paper were cleaner than people. He looked at the tube and did not touch it. He was out checking south markers the winter the storm came in. Horse went lame. He walked the last 4 miles and didn't make the house in time. The stove gave a low iron pop behind them.
I'm sorry,
Hannah said. Caleb shook his head once. Town says weather took him. Weather helped. He swallowed. Truth is, I should have gone out sooner. I knew he was overdue. I told myself he'd turn up because I didn't want to ask Pike for a fresh horse and hear about it the rest of my life. There it was at last, the shape beneath his silence. Pride fused to grief so tightly he no longer separated them. Hannah laid her hand flat on the survey tube. A man can be wrong once and spend years trying not to owe that mistake twice. He looked at her sharply. And a woman, she said, can be sent away enough times that she begins to mistake caution for strength. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Caleb reached for the tube. His hand brushed hers. Not accident this time. Not entirely. The contact was brief and careful and carried more truth than either had spoken plainly. "Open it," he said. So they bent together over Luke Mercer's old maps while the wind worked the corners of the house and the lamp burned low. And if something unnamed had already taken root between them, it put down another inch that night. By February, the valley had begun to talk in a voice Hannah could hear even when no one spoke. It was in the pause when she entered the mercantile and two women lowered theirs. In the way Mrs. Griggs looked past her as if the black dress and plain collar made her either invisible or improper, depending on what suited the moment. In Toby's awkward loyalty whenever he repeated his mother's invitations too loudly, as if volume could defend a person from gossip. Juniper Station had decided that a widow living on a bachelor ranch was a story, and because the truth of work, weather, and plain need offered little entertainment, the town embroidered. Hannah found she minded less for herself than for Caleb. Men nodded to him the same as before, but some did it with an extra sliver of amusement in the mouth. Others with suspicion, as though an unattached woman at his table must mean he had become one of those men who invited ruin in under cover of generosity. Caleb bore it the way he bore sleet, with his head turned slightly aside and his jaw set. That did not mean it did not strike. The practical pressure rose with the social one. A notice came from the bank requiring settlement of the most disputed freight charges before spring thaw. The wording was polite enough to look official and sharp enough to make clear that patience had limits. On top of it arrived a county paper, this one bearing Gideon Pike's signature beneath a claim that the North Spring and the grazing strip beyond it belonged by old marker line to Pike land, not Mercer land. Caleb read the paper once and laid it flat on the table. He's waited till winter because he knows I can't ride county lines clear in this weather, he said. Hannah took up Luke's survey notes and compared dates. Or because he hoped you would simply endure it. That's a mistake many people make. Do you disappoint them often? Only the ones who earn it. Still, the strain in the house changed shape after that. Caleb worked later, ate less, spoke with a rougher edge, not at Hannah, but around the room, as if every chair had grown one leg shorter and required bracing. He considered selling the old sorrel mare. Hannah knew, because she saw him studying the stock list too long, and because the mare herself had begun following him in the barn with the hopeful suspicion animals reserve for men who love them and plan to betray them for sensible reasons. One horse won't mend a fraudulent claim, Hannah said. One horse buys feed. It also carries half your winter. He did not answer. The church in Juniper held a Saturday supper to raise money for the school roof, and Mrs. Haynes pressed Hannah hard enough that refusing would have looked more pointed than attending. Caleb said he needed lamp oil and harness rivets from town anyway, so they went together in the wagon under a sky low with more weather. The church hall smelled of boiled ham, wool coats drying by the stove, and coffee so weak it could only be called coffee from politeness. Children skidded on the plank floor until mothers caught them by the ear. Men stood near the door discussing stock prices and pretending not to glance toward Hannah every time she moved. At first, it was almost pleasant. Mrs. Haynes seated her between two older women who approved of her pie crust and disapproved of everything else in the county with impressive fairness. Toby carried plates. The minister asked after the Haynes baby and thanked Hannah as if she had done more than rub a child's back and stay awake. Then Gideon Pike arrived. He came in late, brushed the snow off his shoulders, and carried conversation around him like a man with money carries scent. People made room instinctively. He greeted the minister, clapped a hand on the school trustee's back, and finally drifted toward Hannah's table with a plate in one hand and his smile already in place. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "Mercer let you out among civilized company." Hannah set down her cup. "Mr. Pike?" He tilted his head. "I had meant what I said before, you know, about lodging. A woman in your position ought to have something more secure than a back room on borrowed acres." Across the hall, Caleb stood near the coat hooks speaking to the blacksmith. He had not yet noticed the exchange. Or perhaps he had and was giving her the courtesy of managing it herself. "My position," Hannah said evenly, "is that of a woman who pays her way." Pike smiled wider. "Town doesn't always see the account so clearly." Mrs. Haynes, seated on Hannah's other side, went very still. Before Hannah could answer, Caleb appeared behind Pike as quietly as weather. "She hasn't asked town to see anything," he said. Pike turned, not startled, but annoyed at having misjudged his timing. "Mercer, I was only making civil inquiry." "Then make it somewhere else." The room did not stop. Church suppers never do. But a thread pulled tight through the noise. Pike's eyes sharpened. "You're touchy for a man who enjoys company." Caleb's face changed by almost nothing. "And you're bold for one standing in a church hall." Pike let that sit, then gave a small laugh and stepped away. But he had already done his work. By the time they reached the wagon later, Hannah could feel the altered attention of the room at her back like candle heat. On the ride home, the snow began again, fine and relentless. "I should not have gone," she said. Caleb kept his gaze on the horse's ears. "Why?" "Because he wanted exactly that." "He wants what he can't earn." "That does not make him harmless." "No." Caleb's voice roughened. "It does not." In the days that followed, Pike's pressure moved from innuendo to paper. A deputy brought word that Pike intended to have the disputed marker surveyed as soon as roads opened. Feed suppliers suddenly hesitated to extend any courtesy. At the bank, where Hannah went alone one afternoon to ask whether corrected freight statements had been entered yet, the clerk looked at her too knowingly and said Mr. Pike had many friends in institutions that preferred neat domestic arrangements. "Meaning what?" she asked. The clerk, who had inherited someone else's smugness and worn it badly, shrugged. "Meaning men in debt do better when they keep households quiet." Hannah left before her anger could disgrace her. That evening, as wind shook the barn door and Caleb spread Luke's survey maps under the lamp again, she said, "Let me take in more work. Sewing from town. Accounts if anyone will give them. I can also go to the station. They need someone to tally freight arrivals twice a week now that Watkins's nephew has gone north." Caleb's head came up. "No." "Why no?" "Because Pike would use every walk you take into town as another excuse to speak at you." "He does that already." "He'd do worse if he thought you needed wages enough to stand still for it." The words hit deeper than he meant. Hannah set the pencil down carefully. "I have needed worse from men than words."
His face closed. "That isn't what I meant." "No," she said. "It is not." But the point remained between them. Need, exposure, the daily humiliations a lone woman learned to absorb because hunger was often ruder than men. Later, after the kitchen had been cleaned and the stove banked low, Hannah went out to the porch for air. The night smelled of snow and distant pine. Caleb came out a minute after, pulling on his coat, though he could not possibly have been warm inside. He stood beside the rail, not too near. "I know what town says," he said. "I assumed as much." "I won't have you driven out by it." She looked toward the dark shape of the barn. "And if I decide to go by my own choice?" He was silent long enough that she turned to him. At last he said, "Then I'll help hitch the wagon." It was not what she had expected. Not a request, not a command. Something harder, perhaps, because it admitted her freedom even where he hated the thought of it. Below them, in the yard, the old sorrel lifted her head from the hay and watched the house with mild, horse-shaped patience. Wind moved through the cottonwoods, dry and whispering. The valley was closing in with paper, rumor, and winter all at once. And for the first time since the station bench, Hannah felt not merely that she might lose shelter, but that she might lose the very life she had begun, against reason, to care for. The blow did not fall all at once. It came in pieces, each one manageable by itself, until together they struck hard enough to split whatever fragile certainty had been growing inside the house.
First, the feed wagon from Miller's yard overturned on the ridge road after freezing rain glazed the incline. Half the sacks tore open in the slush before men could right the axle. Prices rose again by morning. Then the bank's corrected freight statement arrived, with only 2 errors removed and the rest deferred pending further clarification, which was another way of saying the truth would be allowed in only if it came wearing a better coat than Gideon Pike's influence. Then Caleb came in from the barn one evening, carrying the worn halter of the old sorrel mare, and set it on the table with a care that told Hannah he had already made up his mind. "She goes to Walker's sale next Thursday," he said. Hannah stared at the halter. The mare was no ornament. She had packed fence wire, pulled the cutter, carried Caleb over bad ground when his leg was worst. Selling her would buy a few weeks and cost a history. "You cannot mean that." "I do." "She's worth more here than at Walker's yard." "She's worth feed I don't have." Hannah opened her mouth, then shut it. Pride was easiest to wound in the places where necessity had already laid bare bone. That night, after Caleb slept, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling boards while wind thudded dry snow against the shutters. In the dark, she felt the weight of Samuel's ring on the cord around her neck where she now kept it. Beneath the ring hung his watch, the old silver one that had lost 2 minutes every day and still felt impossible to part with because his thumbprint seemed somehow preserved in the worn smoothness of the case. By dawn, she had decided what she would do, and knew it would anger Caleb more than if she set fire to his hay. Juniper Station was all slush and iron-gray sky when she walked into the jeweler's narrow shop. The man behind the counter had careful hands and the expression of one who understood too much about desperation to be dramatic over it. He weighed the ring, opened the watch, glanced at the engraving inside, and named a sum lower than memory deserved and higher than sentiment could sustain. Hannah took it. At the bank, She laid the bills flat and said she was making payment against the Mercer note to prevent immediate livestock liquidation. The clerk smirked until she met his eyes and did not blink. He wrote the receipt. It was done in less than half an hour. Undoing what it meant took the rest of the day. By the time she reached the ranch, a sharp wind had come up and the clouds were dragging low over the ridge. She had barely hung her coat when the dog under the table lifted his head, ears pricked toward the yard. A second later, Caleb came through the door, carrying the smell of smoke on him. "What happened?" Hannah asked, rising at once. "Barn lantern tipped." His voice was flat from pain. "Caught straw by the west stall. Got it out." Then she saw his sleeve blackened at the cuff, the skin at his wrist reddened and angry where sparks had kissed through wool. His expression had gone white around the mouth. "Sit," she said. Instead, he pulled a folded paper from his coat and dropped it onto the table. It was the bank receipt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to narrow around the paper, the stove, the scarred tabletop, the smell of smoke and thawing snow in his coat. "You sold something," Caleb said at last. Hannah steadied both hands on the chair back. "Yes." "What?" "My ring. Samuel's watch." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "You had no right." "I had every right to my own possessions. Not to throw them at my debt." "It was not thrown. It was paid." His laugh came once, hard and joyless. "In town, that distinction won't travel 5 feet. "Since when do you let town choose your thoughts?" "Since town can choose whether a man gets credit enough to keep cattle through March." The words hit, but it was not the anger in them that hurt most. It was the shame. Not hers. His, rising so hot he could hardly stand inside it. Hannah stepped toward him. "Listen to me. If you sell that mare now, Pike wins twice. He takes your ground and leaves you weaker on it. I paid 1 installment. 1. Long enough to breathe." "I did not ask you to buy me breathing room." "You did not ask because you would rather bleed than owe." His eyes lifted then, bright with something raw enough to frighten her. "I know exactly what owing costs." "I know what losing a home costs." The wind hit the side of the house with a flat, sudden force. Somewhere in the mudroom a hook rattled. Caleb's hands opened and closed once at his sides. "Do you think I can sit in town while Pike smiles over a receipt paid for with your dead husband's watch?" "I think your pride is louder than your sense." "And I think," his voice broke rough, then steadied only by force, "I think I won't have this place bought for me. Not by Pike, not by pity, not by a dead man's things." The sentence hung between them, brutal in its precision. Hannah went still. He knew it the instant he said it. She saw the knowledge arrive in his face and fail to unsay anything. Very quietly she asked, "Is that what you think this is?" "No." He dragged a hand through his hair. "No, Hannah." But the name came too late. The wound was already open. She looked at the bank receipt on the table, then at the scorched cuff of his sleeve, then at the room that had slowly learned the shape of her days. The blue-ringed cup by the stove, her gloves on the peg, the basket of mending under the chair. A whole small life, built without promise and therefore somehow easier to break. "One warm meal," she said, and her voice sounded to her like someone speaking from very far off. "That was your offer." "Hannah." "No, let me finish."
She lifted her chin, because if she did not, it might tremble. You gave it freely, and I have mistaken too much since then. That is my share of the fault. He took one step toward her. She stepped back.
He stopped as if he had struck a wall. The rest happened with a terrible calm. Hannah wrapped his burned wrist with salve and clean cloth because injury did not pause for heartbreak. She set supper on the table, and neither of them ate much. Later, while the house creaked under rising wind, she packed the valise with hands that moved more steadily than she felt. Before dawn, she left a note beside the blue-ringed cup. Thank you for the shelter, the work, and the kindness that was real. I should not have mistaken it for a place that was mine to keep. H.V. She took the early wagon road into Juniper Station with Toby's father, who was hauling bolts to the rail shed, and asked no questions beyond whether she was warm enough under the blanket. Snow began again halfway there. By the time she sat down in the waiting room, the same room where she had once been a stranger with nowhere to go, the storm had turned thick and white beyond the windows. Her valise stood at her feet. Her hands lay folded over the black cloth of her skirt. On the bench beside her rested a ticket to Laramie, where Mrs. Bell's cousin had, by a twist of chance, heard of hotel work needing a steady woman. The station stove ticked and sighed. This time, Hannah did not feel humiliated. That would have been easier. Humiliation burns fast. What sat inside her now was colder and heavier. The knowledge that she had let herself belong to a life that had not known how to hold her without fear. Outside, snow erased the road to Cottonwood Draw, one fence post at a time. Caleb found the note before sunrise and stood with it in his hand until the words blurred. Not because he could not read them, because he could. The kitchen looked wrong in ways no stranger would have named. The blue-ringed cup sat by the stove, but no shawl hung on the lower peg. The mending basket was gone from under the chair. The loaf on the board remained half-cut, knife beside it exactly where Hannah would never have left it if she planned to return before supper. He read the note again. Thank you for the shelter, the work, and the kindness that was real. That line cut worst, because it meant she had already sorted what could be trusted from what had failed her. Outside, dawn came as a gray bruise behind storm cloud. Caleb pulled on his coat and went to the barn, with the note still in his pocket, as if movement might improve his mind. It did not. The mare nosed his sleeve. The burned wrist throbbed under its bandage. His left leg complained where cold always found the old hurt. None of it reached the center of him, where Hannah's absence had already made a room echo. Toby Haynes arrived before full light, half buried in scarf and snow. Pa says road to town's near gone, he said. Then, seeing Caleb's face, he stopped. Mrs. Vale leave? Caleb looked at him sharply. You know where? Toby swallowed. Ma said she asked yesterday if there was any train after noon in this weather. I thought maybe. Caleb was already reaching for the saddle. At the barn door, Toby called, Mr. Mercer! Caleb turned. The boy dug a crumpled paper from his mitten and held it out. She dropped this when she was helping Ma with the flour account. I meant to bring it sooner. It was not a flour account. It was the jeweler's receipt, folded around the little paper tag that had once hung from Samuel Vale's watch. Caleb felt something inside him shift with a violence that did not show on his face. He looked at the amount, at the date, at the plain, honest script of the jeweler's hand. Not a grand sacrifice. That made it worse. A private one, done cleanly, done without witnesses because she had meant it as help, not leverage. He thought of the words he had thrown at her. Not by pity, not by a dead man's things. Then he thought of Luke lying under snow because Caleb had been too proud to ride to Pikes and ask for the horse that might have cut 4 miles off the search. Pride again. Always pride, dressed up as principle until it cost blood. He saddled the bay. The road into Juniper Station was nearly erased. Snow drove hard and sideways, filling his tracks as soon as the horse made them. Twice he had to dismount and lead through drifts where the bay snorted and fought for footing. By the time the station roof came into view through the white, Caleb's coat was stiff with snow and his bad leg felt carved from ice. Inside, the waiting room smelled of damp wool, cinders, and the sour coffee the station master brewed when weather trapped travelers. Hannah sat on the same bench as that first night, her valise at her feet, gloved hands folded in her lap. She looked up when the door opened. For a second, neither moved. Then the station master, understanding more than he would ever say aloud, muttered something about checking the freight room and vanished behind the office partition. Caleb took off his hat. Snow slid from the brim and darkened the floorboards. "Road's bad," he said. It was a foolish opening. He knew it the moment it left him. Hannah's mouth moved, not quite smiling. "I can see that." He crossed the room and sat at the other end of the bench, not close enough to touch her, close enough that he could smell the clean wool of her coat under the coal smoke. From his pocket, he drew the small thermos he had grabbed without thinking from the kitchen shelf. The one she had wrapped in cloth for him on cold mornings when he rode fence. "I brought coffee," he said. Her eyes lowered to the thermos, then lifted to his face again. Something in them loosened and tightened at once. "You came all this way to tell me the weather and offer coffee." "No," he swallowed. "I came because I was wrong." The waiting room clock ticked loudly over the window. Somewhere beyond the wall, telegraph equipment clicked once and fell still. Caleb set the thermos between them, but did not yet open it. "I found the jeweler's receipt. Toby brought it. I know what you sold. And I know why." Hannah looked down at her hands. "Knowing after the fact is not especially useful." "No," he breathed out carefully. "It isn't." He stared at the wet floorboards by his boots for a moment before speaking again. The words felt rusted in him from years of disuse. "When Luke was overdue that winter, I knew before dark that something had gone wrong. Pike had the only fresh horse close enough to matter. I didn't ask for it because I was tired of taking his measure every time he handed me anything. By the time I went out, I went late." Caleb rubbed his burned wrist with his thumb. "Since then, every favor feels like a rope around my throat. I see debt where there isn't any. I hear judgment before it's spoken." Hannah was very still. He went on because stopping now would only be cowardice in a cleaner coat. "You paid the bank, and all I could feel was that old shame rising. So I took a knife to the nearest thing that mattered and called it honesty." The words sat between them without defense. After a long while, Hannah said, "Widowhood teaches a different kind of fear." He looked at her. "You discover how quickly people sort you," she said. "Useful, burdensome, proper, suspect. You learn not to ask twice. You learn to leave before being put out." Her fingers tightened once over her glove seams. "When you said what you said, it was not only the words. It was hearing every closed door behind them." Caleb nodded. "I know." "No," she said softly. "I don't think you do. But you are trying, and that matters." He let that stand. At last he unscrewed the thermos and poured coffee into the cup lid. Steam curled up between them. He held it out. This time, when their hands met, neither pretended not to notice. "I won't ask you to come back because I'm lonely," he said. "Though I am." Hannah's lashes lowered. "I won't ask because the house runs better with you in it." His mouth pulled once, wry and tired. "Though it does." Still, she said nothing. He looked straight at her then, no hiding place left in him. "Come back and help me fight Pike. Help me set the account straight and the boundary truer than he wants it. Then, when the weather opens, if you still want Laramie or Kansas City or any place that isn't my table, I'll hitch the wagon myself. But don't go, because I was too proud to know what was being offered me." The station windows rattled under a fresh blast of wind. Hannah held the hot cup between both hands without drinking. Her face, under the black bonnet and traveling veil, looked tired enough to break him. "You ask a great deal," she said. "I know." "You are not easy to forgive." "I know that too." At last she took a sip. The corner of her mouth softened by the smallest degree. "The coffee is burnt." "It usually is." "That is some comfort. I dislike change in all things." He nearly laughed then, and did not, because laughter would have turned the moment too quickly from what it needed to be. The train to Laramie was delayed by the storm. Then delayed again. By noon, the station master announced it might not come till morning if the drift at Eagle Cut remained blocked. Hannah looked at the ticket in her hand, then at the storm, then at Caleb, whose coat was still melting in dark patches onto the bench. "What happens if I come back?" she asked. "We spread Luke's maps. We go through every receipt. We write the county surveyor before Pike does. And I keep my mouth from ruining what my hands would rather mend." A very quiet breath left her. Not surrender. Decision. She folded the ticket once and slipped it into her reticule. The ride home was slower with the storm thickening again. Caleb wrapped her in the wool blanket from behind the saddle. The bay picked his way by memory more than sight. At the house, the stove had burned low but not out. Caleb knelt to feed it, and Hannah, without asking, moved to hang both their coats and set water on. By dusk, the kitchen table was buried in paper. Luke's old survey notes, Pike's claims, freight statements, Hannah's neat columns in fresh pencil. They worked shoulder to shoulder, stopping only when the lamp wick needed trimming. Once, near midnight, Hannah found the old county plat that showed the North Spring line before Pike shifted a boundary stake after Luke's death. "There," she said, tapping the map. Caleb leaned over her, so near she could feel the cold still clinging to him. "You've got it." No triumph flared. Only a deep, shared focus, and under it, something warmer, steadier. When she finally rose to stretch her back, she swayed with weariness. Caleb stood at once. "You should sleep." "So should you." Neither moved. Then he lifted a hand and, with a care that undid her more than urgency could have, touched 2 fingers to the loose strand of hair at her temple and tucked it back beneath her braid. The gesture lasted less than a second. It left the room altered. Zero Spring did not arrive all at once in Cottonwood Draw. It came grudgingly, in thawed ruts by noon and black ice by dawn, in eaves that dripped for an hour and froze again by nightfall, in a creek that remembered movement before it remembered warmth. The land resisted softness. So did the 2 people living on it.
But resistance, Hannah had learned, is not the same as refusal. The county surveyor rode out the second week of March with a face pinched against wind and a satchel full of instruments he treated more tenderly than most men treated relatives. Gideon Pike met them at the north line in a fine coat too good for mud. Caleb came with Luke's notes rolled in oilcloth. Hannah came with the ledger pages, the corrected freight columns, and the old county plat she had found in the chest.
Pike smiled when he saw her, and lost the smile by inches as the morning went on. The old markers lay where Luke's map said they would, one buried under years of grass and silt, one half split by frost, one moved from its original setting by no natural force at all. The surveyor was not a dramatic man. He simply measured twice, wiped his spectacles, and said, "This spring line belongs to Mercer acreage by every record I have, including the county plat and the prior chain." Pike objected in a polished voice. Hannah answered with dates. Caleb answered with facts. The surveyor answered with a look that suggested he disliked being paid to confirm what should never have been disputed. At the bank 2 days later, Hannah placed Pike's duplicated freight charges and the county finding side by side on the clerk's desk. The bank manager, who had discovered in recent weeks that Gideon Pike's confidence was not as good as collateral, reviewed them with the grave interest of a man rearranging his loyalties. The disputed charges were struck. The note was extended through summer cattle sales. When they stepped back onto the boardwalk, Juniper Station looked no kinder than before, only less certain of itself. Mrs. Haynes embraced Hannah outside the mercantile with no regard for who saw. Toby nearly split in half with pride when Caleb told him the North Spring was safe. Even Mrs. Griggs thought enough to say, "Well, a woman who can read county plats may as well stay where she's appreciated." Hannah answered, "That is nearly gracious from you." "It is all I had prepared." At home, the work changed with the season. Calving began. Fences had to be reset where snow had laid them flat. Mud claimed boots by the pound. Hannah traded sewing hours for account hours, keeping the sale records so exact that Caleb stopped checking them and started simply asking, "What do the numbers say?" as if they were a weather report, and she the only one who could read the sky. She also planted a kitchen patch once the ground softened enough to take a spade. Onions, beans, a narrow row of carrots. Caleb built the fence around it without being asked, arguing only once about whether chickens truly had a talent for evil. "They do," Hannah said, hands on hips. "They're birds." "They are vandals with feathers." He looked at the half-dug bed, the tracks already scratched near the corner, and conceded the point with a grunt. There were other changes too small for proclamation and too deep for accident. A second chair appeared on the porch after Caleb repaired the runner on the old one from the back shed. Her apron hung now on a peg beside his work coat, not in the guest room. The blue-ringed cup was no longer thought of as borrowed. When she rose before dawn, he shifted over at the stove without looking as if he had been making space for her there his whole life. Still, the important thing remained unsaid. Not because feeling lacked, because both had lived long enough to know that naming matters most when there is something solid beneath the word. The naming came on an evening in late April after rain. The air smelled of wet earth and cottonwood buds. Frogs had begun again down by the creek. Hannah stood at the kitchen table cutting bread, while Caleb came in from the barn, carrying a small wooden box under one arm. "What have you got there?" she asked. He set it on the table. It was made of pine, plain but sanded smooth, with a hinged lid and a hasp polished by his thumb. "For your papers," he said. "Letters, receipts, the things you keep stacked in flour tins like you expect mice to honor privacy." Hannah ran her fingers over the lid. "This is handsome work." "It's square enough." She lifted the lid. Inside, on top of folded blank paper and a stick of sealing wax, lay Samuel's watch. She went very still. Caleb watched her face. "Jeweler in town had it still. Said a widow with sense sold it, and a fool of a rancher came later to pay double." Her throat tightened so sharply she had to set one hand on the table edge. "You should not have done that." "That's what you told me about the gloves." "I meant it then, too." "I know." She lifted the watch. Its silver case was warm from the room. The engraving inside, SV, with a date from another life, looked both nearer and farther than before. "I can't take this back as though nothing happened," she said. "I'm not asking you to." The rain ticked softly from the porch roof. Somewhere outside, the old sorrel stamped in the barn and settled again. Caleb put both hands flat on the table, as if he needed the steadiness of wood under them. "I don't want you here out of gratitude," he said, "or because Juniper has nowhere better to put a widow with good handwriting. I don't want you staying one season at a time while I pretend that's enough." He drew breath, slow and hard-earned. "I want you here because this place is yours now, in every way that matters to me. I want to build the years with you, if you'll have them. No hurry on a church or paper. No grand promises beyond the ones I know how to keep. But I'm done calling you a guest." Hannah looked at him. The man who had once offered one warm meal as if that were the largest, safe kindness. The man who carried grief like a weather front inside his ribs. The man who had made room for her with nails, gloves, survey maps, and burnt coffee long before he could say her name without caution. "You are not easy," she said, because truth deserved the first place. "No." "You are stubborn, proud, and occasionally impossible." "I've heard rumors." "And your coffee remains disgraceful." "On that point, I won't argue." Her laugh came then, sudden and wet-eyed and real. She closed the watch in her hand. "When Samuel died," she said, "I thought the rest of my life would be waiting rooms. Places where I could sit for a little while, if I was quiet enough, and paid in advance." She swallowed. "Then you put a bowl of stew in front of me and told me not to talk of repayment. I think I have been trying to answer that meal ever since." Caleb's face changed, gentled by something deeper than relief. "Hannah," he said. She set the watch down, stepped around the table, and rested her hand against the front of his shirt, where his heart beat steady and strong under work-worn cloth. "Yes," she said, "I will stay. And when you ask me proper, I expect a cleaner collar than that." His hand came up over hers, rough and warm. "That sounds like extortion." "It sounds like standards." He bent then, slowly enough to give her all the room in the world to refuse, and kissed her. It was not a young kiss, not careless, not hungry in the way of people with no history. It held apology, gratitude, restraint, and the astonishing tenderness of two lives that had come hard against loneliness and chosen, despite knowing the price of attachment, to turn toward it anyway. Later, they ate the supper gone half cold and did not care. Rain softened to mist. The lamp burned low. On the table sat the pine box for Hannah's papers,
Samuel's watch returned to her not as a chain to the past, but as something that could now rest beside it. By the time the next winter came, there was no peg in the house that did not know her shawl, no account book Caleb trusted without her eye, no morning in which the second cup was poured without thought for where she sat. In town, people still talked because towns always do. But the story had changed. Or perhaps the story had finally become simple enough to survive their handling. A widow had once sat at the station with nowhere to go. A cowboy had offered her one warm meal. What grew from that was not rescue and not charity. It was slower and stronger than either. It was wood carried in before a storm, a fence mended straight, a cup kept by the stove.
A bad man beaten with patient truth. A house learning a second heartbeat. Two people who had been lonely enough to recognize in each other not romance first, but work, dignity, and the courage to remain. And in the years that followed, whenever cold weather came down early and the station lamp burned against the dark, Hannah would sometimes think of that bench, that hunger, that first bowl of stew sending steam up into her face. She would look then at the table where Caleb sat, broad shoulders bent over some harness buckle or sail slip, and at the place set across from him with her blue-ringed cup waiting. Then she would carry in supper while the house filled with warmth, and the life they had built would answer the old loneliness in the plainest, truest way it could. Come in. You are home.